I've stood in front of Buckingham Palace maybe 2,000 times. I'm not exaggerating. I do walking tour for a living, and that gate is the last stop on my morning loop. 5 days a week, rain or shine, mostly rain. I could give you the spiel in my sleep. Built in 1703. Bought by the Crown in 1761. The flag tells you if anyone's home. Don't touch the railings, the guards won't smile, no, they really won't, please stop trying to make them. So when I tell you that the strangest thing I ever saw in my life happened at that gate, on an ordinary gray Tuesday, you have to understand the kind of person saying it. I'm not a man who's easily moved. I've seen tourists faint in the heat. I've seen a marriage proposal go horribly wrong right there on the pavement. I've seen a man dressed as a traffic cone get arrested. London does that to you. After a while, nothing lands. This landed. This one I still think about when I can't sleep. Let me tell it to you the way it happened, because if I jump to the end you won't believe me, and honestly I don't blame you. I almost don't believe it myself, and I was 3 feet away. It was late October, the kind of London morning where the sky can't decide what it wants to be. Not raining, not clear, just this flat, low ceiling of clouds sitting over the whole city like a lid on a pot. The air had that whetstone smell it gets, cold enough that you could see your breath if you really looked for it. I had a small group that day, 11 people, a retired couple from Ohio who kept calling me young man, which I'll take, I'm 38, 2 backpackers from Australia, a family of 4, a quiet woman traveling alone who I never quite figured out, and one older gentleman at the back who I'd clocked early. The way you do this job long enough, you start clocking people. He was tall, or he'd been tall once, you could tell, the way he held his shoulders even though age had started folding him inward a little. Silver hair, neatly cut. A long dark coat that looked expensive in a quiet way, the kind of expensive that doesn't want you to notice. Leather gloves, he had this stillness about him. Most people on a tour are fidgeting, checking phones, asking when lunch is. He just watched, listened, asked one good question the whole morning and then went quiet again. I figured him for a retired professor, maybe a diplomat, somebody who'd lived a serious life. He had 2 people with him who weren't on my list, a man and a woman, and they hung back at a polite distance, and it took me until the National Gallery to realize they weren't family. They were watching the crowd, not the art. One of them had an earpiece, the little curl of clear plastic behind the ear that you only notice once you've noticed it. That's when something in the back of my head went, huh. But I didn't push it. You don't in this job. People come to London to be nobody for a week. A man wants to walk around in a gray coat and look at paintings without being asked who he is. That's his business. I just kept doing my bit. Pointed out the lions in Trafalgar Square. Told the joke about Nelson I always tell. Got my laugh. We made our way down the mall toward the palace. The trees along there had gone gold and were starting to drop their leaves, and they crunched under us, wet and soft. The big flag was up over the palace. Someone home. I told the group that, and the woman from Ohio gasped like I'd told her the king himself was making tea. And the old man at the back smiled, just a little, first time all morning. Now I have to tell you about the guards, because if you don't understand the guards, you won't understand what happened. People think the guards are decoration. They're not. They're real soldiers. Coldstream Grenadiers, the Foot Guards, regiments older than most countries. The bearskin hat and the red tunic, that's the costume people photograph, but underneath it is a young man or woman who has done the training, who could be sent somewhere terrible next year, who is standing there in the cold doing one of the hardest things a person can do, which is nothing. Standing still, saying nothing. Letting the whole world come right up to your face and not flinching. I've watched tourists do everything to crack them, wave hands an inch from their eyes, shout, sing. A kid once blew a party horn straight at one and the guard didn't so much as blink, and the kid burst into tears, which served him right. They're trained to it, they have little tricks, they focus on a fixed point, they count. Some of them, I've heard, do maths in their heads, big long sums, just to hold the mind somewhere while the body stays locked. They're allowed to move on a schedule, the slow march back and forth, the turn, the present. but the rest of the time, stone. They are paid in a sense to be stone. In all my years I have seen a guard break exactly twice. Once when an old woman collapsed and one of them called out, "Make way." In a voice like a cannon, which is allowed, they can act if someone's in danger. And once, years back, when a guardsman's foot slipped on ice and he went down hard and got straight back up, red-faced, furious at himself, eyes front like nothing had happened. People laughed. I didn't. I knew what that cost him. So 2 times in 2,000 visits, that's the baseline. That's how rare it is. Remember that. We got to the gate around 11:30. The crowd was thick, the way it always is, 3 deep against the railings, phones up, everybody trying to get the shot with the guard behind the bars looking like he's standing for a painting. I steered my group to a spot a little off to the side where the view's better and the crush is less, a trick of the trade, and started into my closing speech. There were 2 guards on duty that I could see, one up by the sentry box doing his slow walk, and one nearer to us posted, still facing out. Young. They're all young when you get close. This one had a face like he'd be carded buying a pint under all that solemn weight of the uniform, pale, a little flush of cold at the cheeks, eyes fixed on the middle distance over all our heads. I gave my speech. The bit about the changing of the guard, the bit about how you mustn't touch them, the usual. My group did the usual things. Photos. The Australians tried to get a selfie and angle it so the guard looked like he was photobombing. The kids dared each other to get closer. And the old man in the gray coat just stood at the railing and looked at the young guard. Not the way tourists look. Tourists look at a guard the way you look at a statue or a fountain, like it's a thing. This man looked the way you look at a person, right at his face, steady, almost like he was waiting for something. I noticed because I notice, it's the job. What I noticed next I almost didn't believe. The guard looked back. Just a flick, a fraction of a second. The eyes came down off the middle distance and found the old man's face and held there, just for a heartbeat, and then snapped back up to the fixed point. You'd have missed it. Everyone did miss it. 11 people 3 feet away, phones out, and not one of them caught it. But I've spent 15 years learning to read those faces precisely because they give you nothing. So when one gives you something, even a flicker, it's like a shout. I imagined that. Then it happened again. The old man saw it too. I know he did because his whole body changed. He'd been standing easy, hands in his coat pockets. Now he went very still, the particular stillness of a person who has just understood something. He took 1 step closer to the railing. His 2 minders, the man and woman with the earpieces, drifted in a half-step behind him, smooth as you like, not alarmed, just closing the gap the way they probably did 100 times a day without thinking. The guard's jaw moved. Now I want to be precise here because this is the part that matters. A guard's jaw is not supposed to move. The face is held. And this was tiny, the smallest possible thing, a tightening at the corner of the mouth, the kind of motion a person makes when they're trying very hard not to make a different, bigger one, when they're holding something down. The young man was fighting his own face. And I thought, with a cold drop in my stomach, something is happening here that I don't understand. I stopped talking. I think I was mid-sentence, telling the Ohio couple about the Victoria Memorial, and I just trailed off, and the woman said, "And then what, young man?" And I said, "Sorry, 1 second," and I didn't even look at her, which isn't like me. I was watching the old man and the boy in the bearskin hat, and the 3 feet of cold October air between them, and I had the strangest feeling, like I'd walked into the middle of a story that had started a long, long time ago in some other country, before I was even born. The crowd churned and chattered. A bus rumbled past on the road behind us. Somewhere a child was crying about an ice cream. The whole ordinary machinery of a tourist morning grinding on, and right in the middle of it, 2 men were looking at each other like the rest of us weren't there at all. I should tell you what I knew about the old man by then, which was almost nothing, and what I'd guessed, which was getting closer. I'd figured out he was American. The accent, the few times he spoke. Educated, careful, a voice used to rooms going quiet when it started. I'd figured out he was important because of the minders, because of the coat, because of the way the rest of the world seemed to arrange itself slightly around him without being asked. What I had not figured out, not yet, was who. That came a few minutes later, and it came from the worst possible person, which was the man from Ohio, who had finally got bored of the Victoria Memorial and turned around and looked properly at the back of his own tour group for the first time all day. He went white, then red, then he grabbed his wife's arm hard enough that she yelped. "Margaret," he said, in the loud whisper of a man who has never once in his life successfully whispered. "Margaret, Margaret, do you know who that is?" And he said a name. I'm not going to give you the name. Not because I'm being coy, but because I made a decision that day, standing on that pavement, and I've kept it, and I'll keep it telling you this now. I'll call him President Aldridge. Henry Aldridge. That's not his name. But it's close enough to the kind of man he was, and far enough to let him be a person and not a headline, which is the one thing he was clearly trying so hard to be that day. A person. Just a person in a gray coat on a gray morning, 3,000 miles from home. A former president of the United States. On my tour, standing at the railing of Buckingham Palace, looking at a 20-something soldier in a bearskin hat, like the boy held something he'd been looking for his whole life. The Ohio man started fumbling for his phone. I put my hand over it, gently, but I put it there. He looked at me outraged. "Sir," I said low, "please, just for a minute, please." I don't know why I said it. I think some part of me already understood that whatever was about to happen wasn't ours to take. It wasn't content. It wasn't a photo op. It was something else, and it deserved to happen unrecorded, the way real things mostly do. He must have seen something in my face because he stopped, put the phone away, nodded slow. And we all turned back to watch. President Aldridge was an old man now. I keep coming back to that because it's important, and because it's easy to forget when you've only ever seen someone as a face on a screen, full of power, full of certainty. The man at the railing was none of those things. He was old. His hands, when he took them out of his pockets and rested them on the cold iron of the railing, were thin and spotted and trembled very slightly, the small tremor that comes for all of us if we live long enough. There was grief on him, too. I didn't know its source yet, but I'd been reading faces long enough to know grief when it's standing right in front of me. He wore it the way some men wear a coat they've forgotten they have on. I'd later pieced together why he was in London. There'd been a funeral the week before. Someone he'd known a long time. The papers had mentioned it in passing, a former statesman, and Aldridge had come to pay respects, and then the way the recently bereaved sometimes do, he'd lingered. Hadn't wanted to go home to a quiet house. Had asked his people, almost embarrassed, if maybe just one morning he could do something normal, a walking tour, like a tourist, like anybody. That's how a former president of the United States ended up at the back of my group of 11 on a gray Tuesday in October. He just wanted to feel like a person for one morning. And instead he was standing at a railing, looking at a young soldier, and I watched a tear come up in his eye and sit there, not falling, just shining, while the boy in the bearskin hat stared straight ahead and fought with everything he had not to do the same. Here's the thing about that young guard. I've thought about him as much as I've thought about the president, maybe more. Because the president was allowed to feel things. He was a private citizen at a railing. If he wanted to cry, he could cry. Nobody would court-martial Henry Aldridge for crying in front of Buckingham Palace. But the boy in the uniform was on duty. He was a serving soldier at his post in front of the residence of his sovereign. The whole weight of 300 years of his regiment was sitting on his shoulders, along with that ridiculous, magnificent hat. He was not allowed to feel anything. He was not allowed to move. He was not allowed to speak unless someone was in danger. He was, in that moment, supposed to be stone. And he was losing. I could see it. We were close enough now, the few of us who'd noticed, that I could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the overbright shine coming up in his eyes, the way his throat moved when he swallowed. I could see a young man holding back a flood with nothing but training and will, and I could see the training starting to give. The slow-marching guard up by the box reached the end of his beat, turned with a crash of boots and started back. The sound of it cut through the morning, and for 1 second I thought it would break the spell, that the boy would gather himself, that the world would tip back into its normal grooves, and this strange held moment would dissolve and I'd go home and tell my flatmate I'd had a former president on my tour. Ha! What are the odds? It didn't. Instead, the young guard did something I have never seen a guard do in 15 years and 2,000 mornings at that gate. He turned his head. Not far, just enough. Just enough to bring his face square to the old man at the railing, breaking every rule of his post, every line of his training, and his eyes were wet now openly, no hiding it, and his mouth opened. And in a voice so quiet I shouldn't have been able to hear it, but I did. I heard every word. The boy said the thing that brought a former president of the United States to his knees on a London pavement. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what he said, you have to understand what happened 26 years before that gray October morning, in another country, in another life, when Henry Aldridge wasn't a president yet, and the boy in the bearskin hat hadn't even been born. And that's where I have to take you next. I left you at the railing, with the boy's head turned and his mouth open and the words about to come out. I'm going to make you wait a little longer for them, the same way I had to wait that day, because I didn't understand them when I heard them. They only made sense later when I'd learned the rest. So let me take you back, not to London, not to the gray morning and the gold leaves and the smell of wet stone. Take a step back 26 years and a long way east, to a country I won't name for the same reason I won't name the man. A border, winter, a war that most of the world had stopped paying attention to, because the world only has so much attention and it had moved on to something else. I learned all this afterward, you understand. Some of it from a long conversation I'll tell you about at the end. Some of it from things that were written down years ago in places I had to go looking. I've put it together as best I can. I think I've got it right. I think about it enough that I'd better have. In the year 2000, Henry Aldridge was not a president. He was not a senator. He was not anybody you'd have heard of. He was 31 years old and he was a doctor. That surprised me when I found it out. We're so used to seeing the powerful as if they sprang into the world fully formed in a suit, behind a podium. We forget they were young once. We forget they were people who had to choose what to do with their hands. Aldridge had chosen medicine, and not the comfortable kind. He'd finished his training and then, instead of taking the good job and the good life that were sitting right there for him, he'd signed up with one of those medical relief outfits, the ones that go to the places everyone else is leaving. His family thought he'd lost his mind. He went anyway. That tells you something about the man, I think. The thing that made him a president was already in there, 26 years before he became one. He just pointed it at the worst place in the world, instead of at a campaign. That winter, the worst place in the world was a town near that border. I won't even describe it too closely. There are towns like it in every war. You know the shape of it, the shelling, the cold that kills as surely as the fighting. The roads choked with people trying to get out, carrying what they could, leaving what they couldn't, which was usually most of their lives. Aldridge was with a small convoy, a few vehicles, some medics, some supplies, trying to reach a clinic on the safer side of the border before the pass closed for the winter. They were already too late and they knew it. The snow had come early and hard. The radio said the pass would be shut within a day, maybe less, and once it shut, it would stay shut for months. So they were racing, trying to get as many people across as they could before the mountain locked the door. And it was on that road, in that snow, with the light going and the temperature dropping and the war somewhere behind them in the dark, that a young doctor named Henry Aldridge met a woman who couldn't walk any further. Her name I do know, but it's hers and the boys, and I'll keep it the way I've kept the rest. Let me just call her the mother, because that's what she was, That's the whole of what matters. She was young, barely 20, and she was heavily pregnant near her time, walking that frozen road with nothing but a coat that wasn't enough and a small bag and a husband who, I'm sorry to tell you, was not with her anymore. The war had taken him. She was alone and she was carrying a child and she had been walking for 3 days, and on the road in the snow with the light going, her body decided it had walked far enough. The baby was coming. There on the road, in the cold, in the worst possible place at the worst possible time, the way these things always seem to happen. Somebody in the convoy saw her go down. Somebody called for the doctor. And Henry Aldridge, 31 years old, 3,000 miles from the comfortable life he'd turned down, climbed out of the vehicle into the snow and knelt on that frozen road beside a terrified girl he'd never met and would, by every sensible measure, never see again. I've tried to imagine it, I really have. The dark coming down. The cold so deep it hurts to breathe. The mountain ahead with its door about to close. Every reason in the world to say I'm sorry, we can't, we have to keep moving, there are 100 others, we can't stop for one. That's the part I keep coming back to. Because that's the choice. That's the whole of it. Out there on that road, the cruelty of the situation gave him every permission to keep going, and a young doctor decided, alone in the snow, that he would not. He stayed. I'm told it took most of the night. I'm told the convoy made a hard decision of its own, which was to wait. 2 vehicles pulled in close to make a windbreak, headlights on the patch of road, engines running for what warmth they could throw, while the rest went on ahead to get the others over the pass before it shut. So a handful of them stayed behind on that mountain road in the dark, knowing the door might close on them too, knowing they might be trapped there until spring with the war at their backs. For a stranger, for a girl whose name half of them couldn't pronounce. And Henry Aldridge worked. By the light of a head torch and the spill of the headlamps, with hands he had to keep warming on the engine block so they wouldn't go numb, with no proper theater and no proper anything, in the cold and the dark, he brought that baby into the world. It went wrong, of course. These things do. There was bleeding. There was a moment, more than one moment, where by every rule of medicine both of them should have died right there in the snow, the mother and the child, and there was nothing a young doctor on a frozen road should have been able to do about it. He did it anyway. I don't know how. I don't think he fully knew how afterward. He told someone, years later, that he didn't remember most of it, that it was the kind of thing your hands do while your mind stands back and watches and prays. He kept her alive. He kept the baby breathing. When the worst was past and the small new heart was beating and the mother was still there, exhausted and alive and weeping, he took off his own coat, the only coat he had in that cold, and he wrapped the baby in it, and he held the 2 of them through what was left of the night while the snow came down around the headlights. The pass shut behind them just after dawn with the convoy through. They made it across, all of them, the mother, the baby, the doctor with no coat. And then the way these things go, the road forked. The relief workers went one way, back to their lives and their next disaster. The refugees went another, into the long, uncertain business of starting again somewhere safe. They probably exchanged a few words at the parting. They probably said the things people say. Take care of yourself. Take care of him. And then they were gone from each other. The way people are gone from each other after the most important night of both their lives, off into the wide world, never expecting to meet again. Henry Aldridge went home. Some years later he went into public life, because the thing in him that made him kneel in the snow turned out to be the thing that makes a person want to fix the world from the top down as well as the bottom up. He rose. He rose all the way. You know the rest, or you know the shape of it. The mother took her son and built a life, somewhere safe in the end, somewhere green and gray and rainy. She raised him on her own, and she raised him on a story, the story of a frozen road and a stranger who stayed, told and retold on every single birthday the boy ever had, because that birthday was also the anniversary of the worst and best night of her life. An American doctor, she'd say. He didn't sleep. He gave you his coat. You are alive because a man you will never meet decided not to keep driving. The boy grew up, got tall, got serious, and when he was old enough, he did a thing that probably broke his mother's heart a little even as it made her proud, which is that he put on a uniform because some debt to the world had got into him too, the same way it had got into the doctor, and he wanted to serve the country that had taken them in. He joined the guards. Now come back with me to the gate. Come back to the gray morning and the gold leaves and the crowd 3 deep against the railings. Come back to the old man with the wet eyes and the trembling hands, and the young soldier in the bearskin hat who had just turned his head and broken every rule he had. Because here is what nobody on that pavement knew, what I didn't know, what took me weeks to understand. The boy at the gate that morning was the baby on the road. He was 26 years old. Born on a mountain road in the snow into the hands of a stranger 26 years before, raised on the story, brought up on the image of a faceless American who'd given his coat away in the cold. He'd grown up not even knowing the man's name because his mother had never known it either, just the doctor, the American, the one who stayed. A myth, a bedtime story, a reason to be grateful to a world that had treated him hard. And then one ordinary Tuesday, posted at the gate he stood at 5 days a week, with the whole gray, indifferent crowd churning past him. An old man in a gray coat had come to the railing and looked at him. And the boy had known. I asked him later how could you possibly have known? You'd never seen his face. You were a newborn, you had nothing to go on. He couldn't really explain it. He said something I've never forgotten. He said, I'd been looking for that face my whole life without knowing I was looking, and then it was there, and something in me just stood up. The doctor had recognized the boy too, in a way, though he didn't know yet what he was recognizing. 26 years is a long time. Aldrich had delivered the child but only held him through one night. There was no reason on earth he should have looked at one young guardsman in a sea of them and felt his chest go tight. And yet, some men carry a face with them their whole lives without knowing it's there, until the day it walks up to a railing in a bearskin hat. He'd later say he couldn't explain it either. Only that he looked at the boy and felt, for no reason he could name, the cold of a road he hadn't thought about in years. 2 men, 26 years and 3,000 miles and a closed mountain pass between them, looking at each other across 3 feet of London air, each one feeling the floor of the world tilt, neither one yet able to say why. The boy turned his head. I told you that. I'll tell it to you again because I want you standing right where I was standing. He turned his head, the smallest forbidden inch, and his eyes were running now, 2 clean lines down a face that was supposed to be stone, and the old president had gone absolutely rigid at the railing, his gloved hands gripping the iron. And the whole crowd was still chattering and clicking and oblivious. A bus going by, a child crying about ice cream, the ordinary world grinding on. And into the middle of all of it, the young guardsman said, in a voice that was barely a voice at all, "It's you." 2 words, that's all, it's you. The old man made a sound. I won't try to spell it. It wasn't a word. It was the sound a person makes when something they buried very deep comes up all at once, the sound of 26 years arriving in 1 second. And the boy, fighting his own breaking voice, soldier to the last, eyes front again now because he could not hold them on the man and stay standing. The boy said the rest of it, quiet, fast, like he had to get it out before the discipline he'd been trained into slammed the door. My mother told me about you every birthday I ever had, sir, the doctor on the road, the one who stayed. She said I was alive because a stranger gave away his coat in the snow. I never knew your name. I never thought I'd. And he couldn't finish it. The trained stillness took him back, locked his jaw, snapped his streaming eyes to the fixed point over the crowd, because a serving guardsman does not weep at his post no matter what walks up to the railing. And you could see, the war going on inside that boy between the soldier and the son, and the soldier holding barely, by his fingernails. But the old man did not have a uniform to hold him up. Henry Aldridge, who had been a president, who had stood in front of more cameras than any of us will see in a lifetime, who had carried the weight of the world and never once let it show, who had stayed standing through every hard thing a long public life can throw at a person. Henry Aldridge looked at the boy he had pulled out of the snow 26 years before, the boy he had held all night with his own coat wrapped round him, the boy he had given to the world and then driven away from forever. The boy now grown and tall, and standing guard in a foreign country in a tunic, the color of the blood Aldridge had once knelt in on a frozen road. And the old president's legs went out from under him. The old president's legs went out from under him. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing people get wrong when they imagine a moment like that. It wasn't a swoon. It wasn't a slow-motion fall with everyone gasping. It was quiet and it was fast and it was almost gentle. 1 second Henry Aldridge was gripping the railing, holding himself up by the iron, and the next his knees just folded, the way a coat slips off the back of a chair, and he went down onto the cold pavement at the foot of the gate. His 2 minders were on him before he landed. I told you they were good. The man got an arm under him, caught him, took the weight, eased him down instead of letting him drop. The woman was already on one knee in front of him, both hands on his shoulders, her face an inch from his, saying his name, the real one, low and steady. "Sir, sir, I've got you, I've got you." And the old man wasn't unconscious. That's important. He hadn't fainted. His eyes were open and streaming and fixed on one thing, on the boy behind the railings, and the sound coming out of him was the worst sound I have ever heard a human being make. And I want to be careful how I say this, because it wasn't pain. It wasn't grief even, not exactly. It was the sound of a man who had spent 26 years not knowing whether the thing he did on a frozen road in the dark had mattered, whether the 2 lives he'd held through that night had gone on to be lives at all, and who was finding out all at once on a London pavement that one of them was standing in front of him in a red tunic, grown and whole and alive. It was relief. That's what it was. 26 years of a question he'd never let himself ask out loud, answered in 2 words by a boy in a bearskin hat. "It's you." The relief had simply taken his legs. Now here is where the story does the thing that I still can't quite get over. Because the boy moved. I told you, way back at the start, the rules. A guard does not move. A guard does not break his post. A guard is stone. 2 times in 15 years I'd seen one break, and both times it cost the soldier something to do it. But I also told you the one exception. The one thing that releases them. A guard can act, must act. The training itself demands it if someone is in danger. And an old man had just collapsed on the pavement at his gate. So the rule that had been holding that boy prisoner, the rule that had locked his jaw and snapped his eyes front and forced him to stand stone still while the man who saved his life wept 3 feet away, that same rule in one turn of the situation set him free. It didn't just allow him to move. It required it. There was a person in distress at his post. His duty, the very duty that had been torturing him, now pointed the other way. I watched it happen on his face. I watched the boy understand, in half a second, that he was allowed, that the thing he wanted to do more than anything in the world had just become the thing he was supposed to do. He came off his post. He shouldered his rifle in one clean, trained motion, and he stepped out from behind the railing where the gate stood open for the changing, and he crossed to the old man on the pavement, and a sergeant somewhere barked something I didn't catch. But the boy was already there, already down on one knee on the cold stone in his red tunic, and his great, absurd, beautiful hat, already reaching out. And the 2 of them, the old American who'd been a president and the young guardsman who'd been a baby in the snow, came together on the pavement in front of Buckingham Palace, the man's gloved hands gripping the boy's arms, the boy's hands gripping the man's shoulders, both of them weeping now openly, the boy's discipline finally, and completely gone because he had permission, because he was off his post, because a man was in danger and that man was the one who'd given him his coat. I heard the old president say one thing. Just one. Through everything, through the tears and a voice cracked right down the middle, he looked at the boy and he said, "You lived, you lived. Oh, thank God you lived." And the boy held on to him and couldn't say anything at all. I want to tell you the crowd went silent. I want to tell you the whole world stopped and bowed its head. It would make a better story. But mostly the crowd had no idea what they were looking at. That's the truth. To most of the people pressed against those railings, it just looked like an old man had taken ill, and a guard had nobly stepped in to help, which, on the surface, is exactly what it was. A few people did recognize Aldridge, and there was that ripple you get. The phone starting to come up, the whispers, is that, no it can't be, it is. The machine starting to turn. And this is the part I'm proudest of, and I've thought about whether I'm allowed to be proud of it, since all I did was the smallest thing. I turned around to my group of 11. The Ohio couple, the Australians, the family, the quiet woman traveling alone. And they were all standing there with their phones half raised, caught in that moment of deciding, the way we all are now, every day, whether the thing in front of us is something to live or something to film. And I said quietly, "Please, put them down, let him have this one." I don't know why they listened to me. I'm nobody, a tour guide with a lanyard, but they did. One by one the phones came down. The Ohio man who'd nearly blown it 10 minutes earlier was the first, and he had tears in his own eyes, and he just nodded at me and put the phone in his pocket and put his arm around his wife. The Australians lowered theirs. The family. The quiet woman had never raised hers at all. And then, because the strangest thing spread, the people next to us saw my 11 putting their phones away, and some of them did the same, not knowing why, just feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't for them. Not all of them. I won't pretend it was some perfect moment of human grace. There were still phones up further back. There are always phones up. But right there in the inner ring, the people closest to it, a little pocket of the crowd just decided together, without a word, to let two strangers fall apart in something close to private. It's one of the only times in my life I've watched a crowd choose to unsee something. I've thought about it a lot since, about what it says that we even have to choose. It didn't last long. These things never do. There were people coming now, the boy's sergeant and another soldier, a palace official, somebody with a radio. The old man's minders were already getting him up, gently, the woman murmuring to him, the man taking the weight again. They're trained to dissolve a situation, those people. To make a thing stop being a thing, and they were doing it, smooth and quick, steering him back from the railing, away from the lenses, toward a car that had appeared the way cars appear for men like that. And there was a moment, the last moment, that I'll carry the rest of my life. The old president stopped. Right at the edge of it, with his minders trying to move him on, he planted his feet and stopped and turned back to the boy, who was being eased back toward his post by the sergeant, the world reassembling itself around both of them, duty and protocol and reality flowing back in to fill the space that something enormous had just occupied. And Henry Aldridge lifted one trembling hand, and he didn't wave. It wasn't a wave. He just held it up open toward the boy, the way you'd reach for someone across a gap you can't cross. And the boy, back at his post now, back inside the rules, stone again on the outside with his face streaming, did the only thing a guardsman is permitted to do. He came to attention, and he saluted him. Not a soldier saluting a dignitary. You could tell the difference. I don't know how to explain how you could tell, but everyone who saw it could tell. It was a boy saluting the man who carried him out of the snow. It was the only language he had left that the uniform would allow, and he poured everything into it, every birthday, every retelling, every year of a faceless story suddenly given a face, all of it, into one held salute on a gray London morning. The old president brought his own hand to his heart. And then they took him to the car, and the boy stood his post, and the crowd churned back to normal, and a bus went by, and somewhere a child was still going on about ice cream, and it was over, and the world had no idea what had just happened in the middle of it. I should have left it there. I nearly did. I went home that night and told my flatmate, who didn't believe a word of it, and I lay awake, and I thought, well, that's a thing that happened, and I'll never know the rest of it. But I couldn't let it go. You don't see something like that and just file it. So over the following weeks I did some digging, careful digging, the kind you do when you don't want to turn a private thing into a public one. I found the old reports from that winter, the relief convoy, the names that had been written down. I worked out the year, the place, the rough shape of what must have happened on that road. I'm a curious man, and I had a thread to pull, and I pulled it. And then, about a month later, I did something I almost didn't have the nerve to do. I went back to the gate on the boy's off day. I'd worked out his rough roster the way you do when you stand at a place every morning. I waited near the barracks end, feeling like an idiot, like a stalker, holding a paper cup of coffee going cold in my hands. And when a young man came out the gate in civvies, jeans, and a jacket, looking about 19 without the hat and the tunic, looking like absolutely nobody, I recognized him anyway, and I went up to him, and I said, "You won't remember me, but I was on the pavement that day. The day the old man fell." He went still, the way he'd gone still at the railing, and then he looked at me properly and he said, "You're the one who told them to put their phones away." I hadn't known he'd seen that. He had. From inside the breaking, from the middle of the worst and best moment of his life, some part of that boy had clocked a tour guide turning around and shielding him. Soldiers notice things. It's the job. We went and got a proper coffee, and he told me the rest of it, all the things I've told you, the road and the snow and the coat and the birthdays and his mother and the story he'd grown up inside. He told me his mother had cried for an hour on the phone when he called her that night, that she hadn't believed it either, that she'd made him describe the old man's face 3 times. And he told me they'd met again, properly, that it had been arranged quietly away from everything, the old president and the mother and the son, a private room and no cameras and 3 people in 26 years. He wouldn't tell me much about it, and I didn't push. He just said, "My mom got to say thank you after all this time. She got to say it to his face." And his eyes filled up and he looked away down the street, and we let it sit there between us, the size of it. That was when he said the thing I told you earlier. I'd asked him how he could possibly have known at the railing with nothing to go on, and he was quiet a long time. And then he said, "I'd been looking for that face my whole life without knowing I was looking. And then it was there, and something in me just stood up." I asked him one more thing near the end, when the coffees were done, and we were both about to go back to our ordinary lives, the soldier to his post and the tour guide to his loop. I asked him what the old man had said in that private room, if there was one thing he'd hold on to. And the boy smiled, this small, wrecked, beautiful smile, and he said the president had told him something he'd carry forever. He said Aldrich had taken his hand and looked at him and said that for 26 years he'd wondered if it had been worth it. The road, the night, the choice to stay when every sensible voice said drive on. He'd done a great deal of good in his life. The man said big things, important things, things with his name on them that filled history books. And none of it, had ever quieted the small, frightened question of whether one night on a frozen road, when nobody was watching and nobody would ever know, had actually mattered. And then he'd looked at the boy, alive and grown and standing in front of him, and he'd had his answer. The boy told me Aldrich said, "I've spoken to kings and I've spoken to crowds of 100,000, and I have never in my life heard anything like the sound of you saying it's you. I'll hear it the rest of my days. It was the sound of the only thing I ever did that I'm completely sure about. I still do the loop, 5 days a week, rain or shine, mostly rain. I still finish at the gate. I still tell people not to touch the railings and not to bother trying to make the guards smile. But I tell them something else now at the end, when I've got a group that seems like they'll take it the right way. I tell them to look at the guards properly before they go. Not as statues, not as photo backdrops. I tell them that every single one of those still, silent young men and women has a whole life behind their eyes, a mother somewhere, a story, a road they came down to get to that spot. I tell them you never know what you're standing in front of. And sometimes, if the group is right, I tell them about the day an old man fell down at the gate, and a guard who wasn't allowed to move came off his post anyway, because a rule that had been a prison turned in one moment into a door. I don't use his name, I don't use the president's, I never have and I never will. It was never mine to give away. But I'll tell you the thing I've come to believe, standing at that gate 2,000 mornings and one impossible one. We spend our lives wondering if the small good things matter. The night you stayed when you could have gone, the coat you gave away, the hand you held in the dark when no one was watching and no one would ever know. We do them and we drive on and we never find out. Most of us never find out. But the road is longer than we think. And every so often, 26 years down it, on a gray morning a long way from where you started, the thing you did when nobody was watching turns its head and looks right at you and says, "It's you." And then you'll know.